James 3, 1 through 12. Not many should become teachers, my brothers, knowing that we will receive a stricter judgment, for we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a mature man, who is also able to control his whole body. In the movie Brave, there's this character. She's the Queen Eleanor, and she is the mother of an impossible child. A little energetic, red-headed little girl who wants to run and jump and ride horses and shoot arrows and slay the dragon like her brothers. A lot more like a girl, in my experience with my daughters, than the typical Barbie princess ideal. But nevertheless, this child, the queen, is trying to raise her daughter to be a queen. And so she's constantly telling her daughter, act like a princess. And her daughter will come into the castle and she'll be sitting down for dinner and she'll set her bow and arrows on the table there with all the food. And her mother will say, a princess never puts her weapons on the table. And the daughter will kind of groan, oh, Mom. And in the movie Brave, the little girl character doesn't want to be a princess. And the struggle is the little girl is always disappointing her mother. Because in reality, if we look at the expectations put upon a queen or a princess, someone of royalty who has to have good manners and rule the country nobly, I'm not saying they're bad standards, but that there's an expectation of a queen. The problem of a child trying to live up to those expectations is it's a child. And so the child is constantly disappointing her mother. Now, when we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we also guide the whole animal. And consider ships. Though very large and driven by fierce winds, they are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. The struggle that child is experiencing, trying to be both a child and act like a princess, is that same struggle you and I are going to look at today. There's a high goal set for Christians. The goal is to be like Jesus, to be more like Jesus, to do things God's way, to please our God. But we're humans, and we have a human nature. And so there's a struggle because as humans with a human nature, we can rarely attain the high standards that's there for us. So too, though the tongue is a small part of the body, it boasts great things. Consider how large a forest a small fire ignites. And the tongue is a fire. The tongue, a world of unrighteousness, is buried among the parts of our bodies. It pollutes the whole body, sets the course of life on fire, and is set on fire by hell. And when you take a high standard and a human nature and you put them together, you have a hypocrite. Now, that's because we don't see it the right way a lot of times. You wouldn't look at the little girl from Brave and the expectation of her to act like a queen. You wouldn't look at the girl and when she says, I'm a queen, but then acts like a child and sloshes her food and stays up too late. You wouldn't look at that child and say, that child's a hypocrite. That child's not acting like a queen. Yet that's the expectation on us. We're children. We have a human nature, and we have a high expectation. And there's this hypocrisy problem that comes along with that because of who we are inside. And the answer is we're both. Just like the child is both or becoming a queen. She's part of both things. We are part of both things. We are part human nature and part new creature. We've been redeemed, we've been reclaimed if we believed on Jesus Christ. All the old things have passed away, things have become new, but we live in this flesh. And in this flesh, it's impossible for us to live up to a high standard, which is where the hypocrisy comes into. The hypocrisy part of this, a hypocrite is someone who says one thing and does another. James points at that when he says, blessing and cursing comes out of the same mouth. That ought not to be. We're to be like Jesus. And that's what James is worried about. But blessing and cursing comes out of the same mouth. You and I have that problem. Blessing and cursing comes out of our mouths. And yet we claim to want to be like Jesus, but we're afflicted by the old man, by the flesh, by what we live in. Every sea creature, reptile, bird, or animal is tamed and has been tamed by man. But no man can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. The first part of this chapter, James gives that warning specifically to teachers. He's telling teachers to listen up because if a teacher desires to teach others and has this hypocrisy problem, that's going to be an issue. That's going to hinder the ministry. We ought not to be hypocrites. We ought to be more of the Jesus and less of the human nature, but sometimes that human nature takes over. So we're made in the likeness of God, and being made in the image of God includes our tongue. And as those who are renewed in our spirit, as those who are claimed as one of Jesus' own, we're expected to live in the new manner, to walk in a new way. And the high goal of living like Jesus was expressed by James when he talked to his original audience. If you look in verse 7, James compares animals to men. How animals can do something, or animals have been tamed, but tongue can't be tamed. In the original audience, this would have been very offensive. They would have seen it as a vile, a base, a rude thing to say as a teacher, to compare man to any kind of animal, because they believed men were better than animals and we can't be like animals. There's a striking narrative that James is trying to get across, which is there's a high goal. We have to turn from the base things and look towards the things of Jesus, the things of God. We praise our Lord and Father by it, and we curse men who are made in God's likeness with it. Praising and cursing come out of the same mouth. My brothers, these things should not be this way. I think many times you and I forget to recognize that we have a problem. You and I have a problem. I have a problem. I bless and curse with my mouth, and that's not okay. But you have that problem too. In fact, I bet every one of you can think of someone who will tell you, I just say what comes to my mind. Or maybe someone will cover it by saying, I'm just being real. I think that's a cover for a larger problem. Because James thinks that they're not just saying what comes to their mind. They're actually not able to say what comes to their mind. When it comes to their mind, they have to say it. Their tongue isn't bridled. There's an underlying problem of an untamed flesh, which is why we say what comes to our mind. And it's not a small problem. In fact, in Romans chapter 1, there's these verses, 29 through 32. And these verses are usually used by pastors or teachers to look at the Pauline condemnation of homosexuality. There's a biblical standard for gender and sexuality, and I'm not going to get into that now. But this passage that talks about people who are of a corrupt mind, and homosexuality is in that list. There's 21 bad things you'll see in that passage, and I'd encourage you to go look it up later if you get a minute. But there's 21 bad things in that passage. 4 of those things, those sins, 4 of those sins that happen with a corrupt mind can only be committed with your tongue. And over half of the sins in that passage of 21, the primary means of committing that sin is using your tongue to commit that sin. Over half of the one in 21. You see, there's a standard set for all of us. It includes our sexuality. It includes the way we live. But what James is focusing on today is it includes the way we talk. We need to talk like new creatures. Remember that James, this is his handbook to new believers, to the tribes that are in the dispersion. Does a spring pour out sweet and bitter water from the same opening? Can a fig tree produce olives, my brothers, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a saltwater spring yield fresh water. On the positive note of that, there's Ephesians 4:29, where we're commanded to speak only things that are good. And if we believe that, if we believe that these are commands and this is how we're supposed to live, whenever we fail, we're sinners. We're part one thing, part old man and old nature, and part new creature, and we're hypocrites deep down because we say one thing, we say we believe it, but we live another way. In Ephesians 4, I wish I could say I had an Ephesians 4:29 mouth. That is the goal for us, but many times we don't have that. James talks about this as a destructive fire, as something that can take over very quickly. It reminded me of an incident that happened in 1913. It's called the Italian Hall Disaster, or the 1913 Massacre. What happened was on December 24th in Michigan, there were a bunch of miners, and they were embroiled in some political issues. So we're not sure who initially yelled this. But at their Christmas party, someone yelled fire when there was no fire. And the result was a stampede that left 73 people dead, of which 59 were children. And I think of the effect of someone yelling fire. And we think maybe that was to deal with the political problems with their time. Someone was actually trying to cause disruption at this party. But I think of someone yelling a small word like fire. And James talks about it being a fire and how much damage the fire of our tongue can cause. Real quick, let me get down to the brass tacks for you. What do we say? What do we say? I started working on my master's in counseling. I'm not done with it yet. I'm still working through that. The reason I started working on my master's in counseling was I would find myself as a paramedic in the back of an ambulance with an attempted suicide victim, and we'd be taken into the hospital and I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to say. Right when my kid's hurt, my kid comes to me and my kid says, "Daddy, I stubbed my toe." I look at my kid and I'll say, "Well, Daddy's going to have to bite it off." And we laugh and giggle and it's all over. You can't say, "Let's bite it off" to an attempted suicide victim in the back of your ambulance. I did not know what to say. And then I took some counseling classes and I realized that counseling isn't about having the answers. It's about listening. So I'd like to encourage you that we might not know what we can say, but we can say nothing. As believers, if you and I control our tongues and say nothing, we have won a victory. We don't have to know the good and graceful thing to say, because if we say nothing, we're taming our tongue. I don't know, because I'm not very far in this process myself. I wish I was, but my big mouth is my biggest sin. But I will tell you this, I'd like to think that as I learn to tame my tongue and say nothing, and I let that tongue be tamed by me, the Holy Spirit can use my tongue and give me good words to say instead of the fleshly ones that I would want to utter. So as believers, when we walk with Christ and our tongue is tamed, I think He'll give us the words as we learn to tame it. And sometimes that just means saying nothing. We have a passage that tells us our tongue is dangerous and we need to be careful with it. I'd like to encourage you to first realize that there's a problem. We have an old flesh, an old nature. We have to put that away and we have to reach for the heavenly things, reach to be like Jesus. Start by taming our tongue, just bridling it, stopping it. And ask the Lord to give us the words to say. Now, when I was looking up words and how they can be used and stuff, I looked at some speeches to try to find an encouraging model for you of things you could say, and I found General George Patton's speech in the spring of 1944. I won't give you that speech and repeat it from a pulpit. It's not worthy. But if you want to look up something to just rile up the gang and go attack the enemy, check out George Patton's speeches.